Here is some background information on the way in which CcpNmr Analysis handles chemical shifts and also chemical shift lists. Many of you are probably familiar with the fact that every spectrum in your analysis project always has to have at least one peak list associated with it. Similarly, each peak list has to belong to a spectrum. In the sidebar, the peak list is always nested beneath a spectrum. Now, peak lists can contain peaks, but they don't have to. To start with, peak lists are always empty. A peak, however, always has to belong to a peak list. What may be less familiar to you is that every spectrum is, and has to be, associated with a chemical shift list. It's shown in the Spectrum Properties dialog box. There is a default chemical shift list which is in every new project, and by default all spectra are associated with that chemical shift list. Now there are, of course, situations when you should be using multiple chemical shift lists. For example, if some of your spectra were recorded on different constructs or even different proteins. If the spectra were recorded at different temperatures or pH conditions, or with different binding partners. Any time you have a set of spectra that give rise to different chemical shifts, then that set of spectra should be associated with its own chemical shift list. Because as you will see in a moment, the chemical shifts get averaged across different peaks, peak lists and spectra. And so you don't want your chemical shift lists from your complex being averaged with the chemical shifts from your free protein. Otherwise you'll end up with weird chemical shifts and will deposit incorrect ones with the BMRB. Note that if you're doing a titration, then each spectrum should, in theory, be associated with its own chemical shift list. You can change which chemical shift list a spectrum is associated with, either using the drop-down menu in the Spectrum Properties box, or you can create a chemical shift list or edit a chemical shift list by double-clicking on it in the sidebar, and then you can move spectra into or out of the chemical shift list. Note that a spectrum can only ever be associated with one chemical shift list at a time. Although a spectrum has to be associated with a chemical shift list doesn't necessarily have to be associated with a spectrum. So for example, you could import a chemical shift list from the BMRB or an automatic assignment program, and then the chemical shift list will be standalone and not linked to any spectra. And we'll come back to that situation again a bit later. Now, a peak doesn't have to be assigned, but you can assign it, at which point it, or literally one of its dimensions, becomes linked to an NMR atom, the label for the peak. At this point, the program will automatically create a chemical shift. If an NMR atom is assigned to a peak, then the program has to have a chemical shift, which basically links the peak position to the NMR atom. And the chemical shift obviously has to sit within a chemical shift list. To work out which chemical shift list that is, the program simply works backwards from the NMR atom to the peak it was assigned to the peak list, the spectrum, and then it gets the chemical shift list. What perhaps isn't so obvious at first sight is that a chemical shift has to be linked to an NMR atom, because the NMR atom is essentially the label for the chemical shift, and without a label you don't know what the chemical shift is or what it's referring to. It's just a random ppm value. So a chemical shift always has to be linked to an NMR atom. Let's now just fill in a couple of other gaps in our diagram. An NMR atom doesn't necessarily have to be assigned to a peak. You can have unused NMR atoms in your project, that's fine. And a chemical shift list obviously doesn't have to contain any chemical shifts. It can be empty, as it is at the start of any new project before you've started picking peaks and assigning or labelling them. Now, in this situation we refer to the chemical shift list and the chemical shifts as being dynamic, because your chemical shifts will change as you assign and deassign peaks. As I mentioned earlier, chemical shifts are averaged across peaks and spectra. If you have two peaks which are both assigned to the same NMR atoms, a very normal occurrence in a 3D spectrum for example, where you might have a strip of peaks all belonging to the same H and N atoms, then the chemical shifts in your chemical shift list will be averaged over all those different peak positions. And of course there may be peaks in other spectra assigned to those atoms too. Those will also all flow into the chemical shift reported in your chemical shift list. The only way you can ensure that a peak will not contribute to the averaged chemical shift is by setting the peak merit to 0. So, if you have a look at a peak table, then you will see that there is a merit column which you can edit. By default, the merit is always 1. But if you set it to 0, then that peak will not contribute to the averaged chemical shift. You can in fact set the merit to any value between 0 and 1, and it will act as a scaling factor for the amount it will contribute to the averaged chemical shift. We are intending to move to a system where you can select whole peak lists as not contributing to the chemical shift averages. This will be particularly useful when importing peak lists from structure calculation or automatic assignment programs, but at the moment this has to be done at the peak level. Now, let's consider the case where for a particular NMR atom we have removed all our peak assignments, that is, assignments to peaks which belong to the spectra which are associated with a particular chemical shift list we are considering. In that case, we refer to the chemical shift as being orphaned. It will still have a particular ppm value and an NMR atom as its label, but where the ppm value comes from and what it means is now potentially a bit unclear. Often this situation occurs when you've made mistakes, perhaps created an incorrect NMR atom and then deassigned it from your peak again. Note that now that the NMR atom is no longer assigned to any peaks, we no longer have the requirement that the NMR atom has to have a chemical shift. But as soon as we make an assignment again, that requirement comes back and the chemical shift stops being orphaned. As I said, very often orphaned chemical shifts arise as part of mistakes that were made and then corrected, and often it is helpful to remove these orphaned chemical shifts from your project. You can do this with a macro. Go to the macro menu, run CcpN macros, and then delete orphaned chemical shifts. Now, let's consider the situation where I'm importing a chemical shift list from the BMRB or another program or project. In that situation, my chemical shift list is not linked to any spectra. And for that reason, no peak assignments that the NMR atom might potentially be used for can have an effect on the chemical shift list. Essentially, the chemical shift list, chemical shifts, and NMR atoms are standalone and decoupled from spectra and peaks. So without any peak assignments, the NMR atom no longer has to have a chemical shift. But obviously a chemical shift still has to have an NMR atom, a label. So if those NMR atoms don't already exist in your project when you import a chemical shift list, then the program will create them automatically. In this situation, we refer to the chemical shift list and the chemical shifts as being static. Note that you can also create a static chemical shift list by making a copy of one of your dynamic ones. That would then be a snapshot of that chemical shift list at that point in time. You can at any point associate a static chemical shift list with a spectrum, but remember that this will turn your static chemical shift list into a dynamic one, and that if this spectrum contains peaks, the chemical shifts in your chemical shift list will automatically be updated. So the chemical shift values may change, or new chemical shifts may be added to your chemical shift list. So, to recap, static chemical shifts don't have a link between their chemical shift list and a spectrum, and therefore there can also be no assignments or links between their NMR atoms and any peaks that will influence them. Nothing in the program will alter those chemical shifts unless you do it manually yourself. Dynamic chemical shifts have a link between the chemical shift list and a spectrum. The ppm value of the chemical shift will vary automatically as you make changes to your peaks and their assignments. Orphaned chemical shifts are a subset of the dynamic chemical shifts. They have a link between the chemical shift list and a spectrum, but at that particular point in time, the NMR atom is not used for any peak assignments. As soon as the NMR atom is used to assign a peak again, the chemical shift stops being orphaned. If you go to your chemical shift list, you can right-click on the header and select Column Settings. Then select to view State, Orphaned and Assigned Peaks. You can now see whether your chemical shifts are dynamic or static, i.e. is the chemical shift list associated with at least one spectrum? And in the case of a dynamic chemical shift list, what are the assigned peaks? These could be one or could be multiple peaks. And if there are no assigned peaks, then the chemical shift is ticked as being orphaned. Now, let's consider what has to happen and what the program's behaviour is if I delete various bits of data from my project in various different situations. In the static case, this is fairly easy. If I remove the chemical shift list, then the program automatically also removes the chemical shifts. Everything else remains as it was. Obviously, the NMR atoms may now no longer be used, but that doesn't matter. It's up to you whether you want to delete those as well. If I delete a chemical shift, then it is simply deleted with no further consequences, other than that its NMR atom may become unused within the project. If I delete an NMR atom, then the program will automatically also delete the chemical shift, because I can't have a chemical shift without a label. For dynamic chemical shifts, it's a bit more complicated. If I delete an NMR atom, then again the program will automatically delete the associated chemical shift. It will also remove any links to my peaks. In effect, my peaks will become deassigned. If I delete any peaks, then I'm removing assignments, links to the NMR atoms. In this case, my chemical shifts may become orphaned. But that obviously depends on whether there are any other peaks left which are assigned to that particular NMR atom or not. And remember, these peaks could be in other peak lists or other spectra associated with the same chemical shift list. If I delete a peak list, then that obviously automatically deletes all the peaks within the peak list. Assignment links are broken, and again the chemical shifts might become orphaned. If I delete a spectrum from my project, then that automatically deletes all the peak lists belonging to it and all the peaks in those peak lists. Again, assignment links are broken, and I might end up with orphaned chemical shifts. Though of course there could still be other spectra associated with that chemical shift list, which then contribute to those chemical shifts. If I wanted to delete any chemical shifts, then I would find that I cannot do that. The program won't let me. Because if an NMR atom is assigned to a peak, then there has to be an associated chemical shift. Dynamic chemical shifts which are not orphaned cannot be deleted. But of course, if my chemical shift is orphaned, then the NMR atom is no longer assigned to a peak, and the requirement for there to be a chemical shift has gone. Now I can delete the chemical shift. So, if you want to delete a dynamic chemical shift, you first have to remove the assignments, and then you can delete it. The right-hand mouse menu in the chemical shift table actually allows you to do those things either individually or in one step. If I wanted to delete a chemical shift list, then I would be faced with two problems. Firstly, the program would need to delete the chemical shifts within it, and we've just said that that is not possible unless they are all orphaned. And secondly, every spectrum has to be associated with a chemical shift list, so what happens to a spectrum if its chemical shift list is deleted? Well, the program won't let you delete a dynamic chemical shift list. That is a chemical shift list which has at least one spectrum associated with it. If you want to delete such a chemical shift list, you first need to associate its spectra with another chemical shift list of your choice. To do this, double-click on the target chemical shift list in the sidebar, or click on New Chemical Shift List, and then move the spectra you want to add to it across into the included column. Remember what happens as soon as you associate your spectra with a new chemical shift list. If you have assigned peaks, then that will either trigger the automatic generation of new chemical shifts, or if chemical shifts with those NMR atoms already exist in that chemical shift list, then they will be modified and their ppm values updated with the peak positions of the assigned peaks in the spectra you've just added to that chemical shift list. So, as soon as a spectrum with assigned peaks is moved to a different chemical shift list, then that chemical shift list will automatically be modified. It's also worth pointing out that if you have spectra whose chemical shifts you don't really need to document anywhere, or where you would rather they don't contribute to the chemical shifts you want to deposit in the BMRB, you can just have a dumping ground chemical shift list. All your dynamics data, for instance, your RDC spectra, your paramagnetic relaxation enhancement spectra, those don't need to feed into the chemical shift list from your assignment spectra that you want to deposit with the BMRB. Just associate all those spectra with a chemical shift list you call unimportant, dumped, or random chemical shifts. And then those chemical shifts will be collected there, but not really used for anything else, and they won't mess up any of your statistics. So I hope this hasn't tied too many knots in your brain. Hopefully for those of you with large projects, it's given you an idea for how you should be handling your chemical shifts and chemical shift lists. And it might also explain some of the behaviour of the programme that you may have observed and may or may not have been expecting. This is also a way for us as the CCPN team to be clear about what our code needs to be doing so as to stay consistent at all times.